I was in the middle of boarding a flight to Zurich, surrounded by the quiet bustle of first-class travelers and polished airport announcements, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with her name. Just the sight of it used to make me smile reflexively, like muscle memory tied to better days. But that morning, something was off. My stomach twisted before I even answered. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was the way her name didn't sit right on my screen anymore. "Hey, you might want to sit down," she said. There was no warmth in her voice, no nervous giggle, no apology, just flat delivery, almost as if she was reading off a script she'd practiced in front of a mirror. I was halfway through the boarding tunnel when I froze. I stepped aside, letting others pass, the weight of her tone sinking in before the words even landed. "I sold the farmhouse," she said. I didn't respond, couldn't. My mouth was open, but the words got stuck somewhere between disbelief and rising nausea. "For 1 million. She added like she was giving me a discount on a pair of shoes. 1 million? I finally managed to say, "It's worth 9. "Yeah, but Ryan needed the capital for his fitness app, and you never really did anything with the place anyway." Ray. The name hit me like a low blow to the ribs. I leaned against the wall of the jetway, my boarding pass crumpling in my hand. "You mean your trainer?" I asked, my voice low and deadly calm. She hesitated, just for a second. That was all I needed. "He's more than that." She finally said, "He believes in me, in us. He needed a partner." I hung up, not because I didn't have more to say, but because if I had said it, I might have screamed, might have cursed, might have lost the last shred of composure I had left in a public airport. Instead, I turned around. I walked straight to the airline desk and canceled my flight to Zurich. I was supposed to speak at the Global Agricultural Summit. I was going to unveil a hybrid irrigation model I'd spent 5 years developing. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting home. The drive from the airport back to the estate took 4 hours. Every mile I drove, I replayed her words in my head like a bad song I couldn't shut off. "He needed it more than you." That line kept echoing, not just because of its cruelty, but because of its arrogance, as if she truly believed she could take what generations had built and hand it over to some clown in gym shorts because she felt inspired. I wasn't even surprised about Ray. I'd seen the signs. Too many sessions that ran late. Too many weekend retreats that had nothing to do with wellness. I had chosen to look the other way, trusting the illusion because it was easier than facing the truth. I let the lies sit in our home like a ghost, silent but present. That was my mistake. But this was something else. This wasn't just infidelity. This was theft. Betrayal wrapped in casual conversation, sealed with a smug sense of entitlement. She thought she was playing chess, and that I was too naive to see the board. But what she didn't know, what she had never bothered to understand, was that the farmhouse she sold wasn't even the real one. By the time I reached the estate gates, the sky had turned a soft gray. Rain threatened in the distance, but hadn't fallen yet. I paused at the entrance and looked up at the wrought iron sign. Toiver Acres. My grandfather's name. His legacy. Our legacy. The house that greeted me was familiar only in structure. It looked wrong, somehow different, like someone had tried to stage it for a magazine cover and failed miserably. Cheap paint covered old brick. New furniture sat awkwardly in a house that once breathed history and purpose. They changed the drapes, swapped out the light fixtures. Even the smell was different, artificial, hollow. But I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask who had moved in because I already knew. The moment she told me what she'd done, I knew she had sold the guest house, the replica, the one I had renovated a decade ago as a distraction project when I was recovering from back surgery. The one tourists came to for weekend retreats. It was a mock-up, a facade, The real farmhouse, the one passed down by my grandfather, had been relocated years ago. She sold a shell. I stood there on the gravel path and let that irony sink in. She thought she had stripped me of everything. She thought she had gutted me to fund her boyfriend's startup dreams. But all she'd done was pawn off an empty set piece, thinking it was the crown jewel. And that's when I laughed. Not a bitter, broken laugh. A real one. Quiet. Clean. I laughed because she had no idea what she had actually done. She had no idea how much worse she had made it for herself. Because now I wasn't just angry. I was focused. I turned my back on the faux farmhouse and made my way to the real one. It sat hidden beyond the orchard, tucked behind an old ironwood grove, and wrapped in the same white brick my grandfather laid himself in the 1940s. I'd moved it there out of sentiment and strategy. I preserved it down to the nail. That was the heart of the estate, and it was untouched. I lit the fireplace and sat in the old wooden chair by the window. I thought about the 10 years I gave to her, the trust, the compromises, the way I used to bring her here when we were first dating, showing her the fields, the soil, the sunsets. I thought she understood what it meant to be part of something older than money, something rooted in time. But I was wrong. The woman I married would have protected this place with her life. The woman she became sold it for a boyfriend's business idea built on protein powders and shallow dreams. I poured myself a drink and watched the fire glow against the stone. I wasn't going to retaliate with anger. That's what she expected. She thought I'd come back swinging. But revenge, real revenge, is never loud. It's meticulous, precise, legal. Tomorrow I'd call Miles. Tonight, I'd let the storm inside me settle, because the real one hadn't even started yet. I stepped onto the land just as dusk began to bleed into the edges of the sky. The soft orange glow kissed the tops of the trees, casting long shadows over the gravel path. It should have hurt seeing the land in this condition, seeing what she had done to it, but all I felt was a cold, steady calm rising through me like smoke through a chimney. I wasn't heartbroken. That emotion had already been burned through. This was something else. This was focus. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked the perimeter. The place had been tampered with, decorated like some weekend getaway from a brochure for city couples looking to reconnect with nature. Someone had power-washed the charm right off the brick walls. There were solar lights shoved into the flower beds, which had been dug out and replaced with mulch and some landscaping stones you could find at any hardware store. But what really stung, what made my jaw tighten, was the absence. Gone were the wind chimes that used to hang under the eaves. Gone was the broken rocking chair my grandfather used to sit in during summer evenings, refusing to throw it out because a man should have one thing he never replaces. Gone were the family photos I'd framed and hung in the hallway when we first moved in. It was like someone had tried to erase the soul of the house. I opened the door and walked in without knocking. The new locks were an insult. She changed them as if I was some intruder, but I had the master key, the one no one else knew about. I installed it years ago during a renovation, back when I still believed I needed to protect the place from outsiders, not my own wife. Inside, it looked worse. She or someone else had painted over the rich mahogany trim in an off-white that looked like drying glue. The old fireplace had been sealed. The scent of lemons cleaner clung to the air like desperation. On the wall where my grandfather's portrait used to hang, there was now some abstract print in black and gold, trying too hard to look expensive. I knew she thought it was an upgrade, a modern touch. But it was just noise. Empty noise. I walked through the rooms like a ghost. I stopped in the kitchen where we used to have coffee on Sunday mornings, where she once burned pancakes so badly we had to eat them with spoons. I stood in the hallway where I used to find her humming to herself as she reorganized the bookshelf for the 5th time. I remembered the smell of fresh apples in September, the muddy boots we used to leave by the back door after harvest walks. None of that was here anymore. And yet the pain didn't come because here's the part she didn't know. What no one knew, really. This house, this shell, it wasn't the real farmhouse. Not anymore. The real one, the one with history in its walls and blood in its bricks, was tucked away on the far side of the estate across the willow-lined creek. I had moved it years ago, slowly, brick by brick, board by board, to protect it. I restored the replica for tourist retreats and business guests, letting this fake version soak up the attention while the real home slept in peace behind a veil of trees and tradition. This house, what she sold, was a decoy. She had no idea. I knelt down near the fireplace and pulled up a floorboard I had hollowed out years ago. Inside was a sealed envelope containing the original deed, clearly marked, signed, and notarized with coordinates and descriptions pointing to the real farmhouse. There was also a letter from my grandfather, one I'd kept sealed until now. I broke it open and read it under the fading light. If you're reading this, it means the house has become a target. We build things in this family not for comfort, but for legacy. If someone tries to take that from you, let them think they've succeeded. The land remembers, and so do we. I closed the letter, set it back in the hollow, and sealed the board again. A deep breath escaped my chest, something between a sigh and a slow release of everything I'd held in since that call at the airport. Outside, the wind started to pick up, rustling the fields that had been left unattended. Weeds were creeping in along the edges. Tools were rusting on the side of the barn. The irrigation pipes I'd spent months designing sat in disrepair. But I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was planning. The next step would be legal. This wasn't about emotion now. It was about consequence. It was about reminding her and Ray that some legacies don't vanish because someone signs the wrong document. This was about restoration, not just of property, but of pride, of clarity. I walked the perimeter of the land one last time before heading back toward the old growth. As I passed the orchard, I stopped to pick a rotting apple off the ground and crushed it in my hand. The juice ran down my fingers, sticky and sour. She thought she could sell off my inheritance for pennies. She thought she could convert 10 years of partnership into a down payment on some man's drain. But all she did was start a fire in a place she didn't understand. I paused at the edge of the grove and looked back. The farmhouse she'd sold stood silent and dumb in the fading light. It looked proud in a hollow way, like someone wearing a medal they didn't earn. She thought she had one, but the truth, she had sold herself out of everything and didn't even know it yet. Tomorrow, I would go see Miles, the old lawyer who'd been by my grandfather's side until the end. He'd know what to do with the trusts, with the clause, with the contract she never bothered to read. She had signed it blindly, trusting that I would never use it. But the moment she moved that money, without my signature, she triggered something irreversible. It wasn't just betrayal. It was proof. And proof was the only thing that mattered now. I walked back to the real farmhouse under the cover of nightfall. The house was lit with a single lamp in the window, glowing like a lighthouse. That's the difference between her and me. She lived for the illusion. I preserved the truth. And now the truth was about to come for her quietly, legally, and with the full weight of a legacy. She never took the time to understand. The next morning, I was already on the road before the sun had fully risen. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I left the estate, the fog still clinging low over the fields like a protective shroud. I didn't sleep much the night before, just enough to keep my mind sharp. Sleep wasn't important. Precision was. What Ela had done wasn't just reckless. It was illegal. She had no idea what she'd walked into when she thought she was making a bold, independent move. I drove to Ashcraft Tofton Granger, the law firm that had handled my grandfather's affairs for nearly 4 decades. Miles Granger was the kind of man who wore linen in the winter and smelled like cedarwood and paper. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharper than his ears should allow, and he never wasted words. When I walked into his office that morning, he looked up from his desk and smirked, just a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "She did it, didn't she?" he asked, pushing a leather-bound folder across the desk. I nodded and sat down. "She sold the shell," I replied. He chuckled, not with joy but with grim satisfaction. "I told you, grandfather, that someone would try one day." Miles said he didn't trust Easy, but he trusted you. That's why he wrote the Iron Class. The Iron Class. Grandfather's final safeguard woven into the estate trust like a hidden blade in a gentleman's coat. It was clear, airtight, and legally binding. No property could be sold, transferred, mortgaged, or liquidated without the written consent of the heir, me. Any unauthorized transaction would trigger immediate legal reversal, asset recall, and full financial restitution payable by the offending party. No loopholes, no exceptions. She signed everything I said. She thought I'd never enforce it. Miles opened the folder and slid her document toward me. "Then it's time." I looked over the form. It was simple. A trigger notice. Once filed with the county register and the family trust board, it would nullify the transaction within 72 hours. But that wasn't even the harsh part. The clause demanded restitution. She would owe the trust every cent from the fraudulent sale plus damages. "This will hit her like a freight train," I said quietly. Not with malice, but with certainty. Miles tapped his pen on the desk. "Good. She needs to understand legacy is not something you gamble." He leaned back in his chair. "Ray's involved, right?" I nodded once. "Then we'll need to move fast. Once people like him smell a crash coming, they start vanishing into the wind." I signed the trigger notice and passed it back to him. My hand didn't shake. We spent the next hour reviewing the trust in detail. I'd read it before more than once, but this time every word felt different. He highlighted parts one hadn't considered in years. Provisions for estate damage, clauses for personal asset freezes, protections for generational holdings. My grandfather had written it with the kind of foresight you only get from surviving 2 wars and a lifetime of betrayal. He trusted love, but documented his land like he was preparing for battle. Before I left the office, Miles handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "Your grandfather's final amendment. He told me to give it to you if this clause was ever used." I took the envelope and slid it into my coat pocket. My fingers ran across the seal, but I didn't open it. Not yet. When I got back to the estate, the air had shifted. It was crisper, cleaner. Maybe it was just my perspective. I walked straight to the study in the real farmhouse and locked the door. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the sale records. Leah hadn't just made a foolish move. She had documented it in painful detail. Her signature, her power of attorney claim forged with a digital stamp. I never approved the wire transfer to Ray's startup account. All right. There. She thought the world was built on charm and momentum. She never understood that it's really built on paper and precedent. I drafted a legal letter, attached the trigger documents, and sent it to her email. Not a text, not a phone call. A formal communication with re-violation of estate clause. Immediate restitution required as the subject line. By the time I finished, it was nearly noon. I poured myself a black coffee and took it out to the porch. The field stretched out before me like an old painting, imperfect, weathered, and alive. I sat down and finally opened the envelope Miles had given me. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment paper written in my grandfather's unmistakable scroll. If you're reading this, then the house didn't protect itself. But that's all right, because you did. You're my grandson, not just by blood, but by backbone. Don't let their noise make you doubt your silence. The land belongs to those who endure it, not just inherited. Forgive where you must, but never forget who tried to erase your name from your own soil. I folded the letter and stared out across the trees. Forgiveness. That part still felt distant. I wasn't sure yet what it would look like. But forgetting, no, that wouldn't happen. Not because I was bitter, but because memory was part of survival. Later that evening, just as the sun started to dip again, I received a reply. Leia. The subject line was empty. The body of the email was short. What the hell is this? You're bluffing. You wouldn't ruin me like this. She still didn't understand. This wasn't about ruin. This was about restoration. She had walked into a battlefield blind, smiling, thinking she was the hero in her own little drama. But this land had its own memory. This legacy had its own rules, and she'd broken them all with a smirk. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the old wooden drawer in the study and pulled out a second file, one that listed every asset still in her name, at least for now. She was still living in the lake house, still driving the BMW I leased under the estate fund, still using the joint credit line, but not for long. Tomorrow, I'd trigger the next clause. Tonight, I'd sleep under a roof she never touched, in a house she never corrupted, on land that remembered every footstep and every betrayal. Because this wasn't just revenge, it was inheritance. And it was time she understood the difference. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Miles had insisted we hold it in his private legal office, not the main boardroom. Less show, more consequence, he'd said, and I agreed. This wasn't about putting on a display. It was about delivering truth with precision. I arrived 15 minutes early. The leather-bound folder sat in my hands like a loaded weapon. Inside was everything. The deed reversal, the trust activation, the wire fraud documentation, the clause enforcement order, and the restitution breakdown. Every page was prepared, signed, and ready for submission. All I needed was to watch her face when she realized what she'd done. At 10:03, the door creaked open and she walked in like she owned the room. Leia wore her arrogance like perfumed, strong, artificial, and impossible to ignore. Her heels clicked against the tile as she entered with the poise of someone who thought this was still a negotiation. Behind her was Ray in a bomber jacket and sunglasses indoors, no less chewing gum like he was at a casting call. He didn't offer a handshake. I didn't offer a glance. Miles gestured for them to sit across from me. The table was wide, cold oak, just like my grandfather's dining table. Fitting. I'm going to speak plainly, Miles began. The doku. What we're doing here is a courtesy. Leia blinked, smiling like she was humoring a child. I'm not sure I understand what the urgency is here. The sale was clean. The buyer was legitimate. Miles didn't flinch. You sold property held in a protected trust without the required written consent of the beneficiary. That triggers what we call the iron clause. He slid the folder across the table to her. She opened it with one manicured hand and started scanning. The shift was immediate. The smile dropped. Her eyes moved faster. Pages turned with increasing panic. Rye leaned over her shoulder. Wait, what is this? He said, frowning now. Restitution clause. Miles interjected calmly. That's the part where the trust sues for damages. The full market value of the illegal sale must be repaid by the offending party, or all associated assets become subject to freeze and liquidation. That includes joint property, vehicles, accounts, anything co-owned or funded through the estate. Isla's voice cracked for the first time. But I didn't know. I didn't mean. You didn't read, I said, finally speaking. That's not a defense. That's negligence. She turned to me then fully. You're really going to do this to me? No, I replied, steady as stone. You did this to yourself? Ray laughed, clearly trying to deflect. Man, come on, it's just a house, and we've got bigger plans now anyway. The app is going public. Miles chuckled softly, almost pityingly. You might want to hold off on that press release, Mr. Raymond. The investment funds your company received were tied directly to stolen assets. That makes the transfer fraudulent. A recall has already been filed with the bank, and an injunction is pending with the local court. What the hell does that mean? Ray snapped. It means, I said, turning toward him, you're going to have to explain to your investors why their seed money was funded with stolen property proceeds. Good luck raising capital from behind a desk with no wheels. He stood suddenly. This is harassment. I'll sue. You're welcome to try, Miles replied calmly, reaching into his drawer and pulling out another envelope. But I would advise you read this first. Ray took it with a scowl. As he flipped through the paperwork, I could see the color drain from his face. Injunctions, fraud implications, wire transfer violations. His name was on every one of them. His signature time-stamped and traceable. The look in his eyes shifted from arrogance to dread in seconds. Leah, meanwhile, was now whispering to herself as she reread the documents. This can't be real. I didn't know. You can't just freeze everything. I live in that house. I need that car. That's my life. It was, I corrected her, until you decided to sell mine. You could have warned me, she said bitterly. You could have told me before it got this far. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You told me on the phone that Ray needed the money more than I did. You made your choice. I'm simply honoring it. She slumped back in her chair, the fire now flickering out. Miles waited a beat, then tapped the final document on the table. This is your notification of breach and formal notice of restitution enforcement. If you wish to contest it, you may do so in court, but I assure you the odds are unfavorable. She didn't move. She just stared at the papers in front of her like they might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. But they wouldn't. Rai turned toward her, his tone suddenly cold. You told me this place was yours. I thought it was, she whispered, eyes wide. I stood. That was enough. I had seen what I needed to see. Before I walked out, I looked at her one last time. I didn't do this to punish you. I did this to protect what matters. Something you never cared to understand. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Outside, the air was crisp and bright. I walked to my truck without looking back. Behind me, I heard Rai raise his voice, demanding answers, demanding money. I didn't care. Let them fight it out among themselves now. They built their house of cards. It wasn't my job to hold it up. What mattered was the land. The real land. The one she didn't touch. The one she never valued because she was too busy chasing something shinier. I drove back to the farmhouse in silence. The folder beside me on the passenger seat. The trigger had been pulled. The clause was active. There was no going back now, but I wasn't grieving. I was reclaiming. Back at the estate, I walked the field alone. The wind was stronger now, pushing against me like resistance, but it didn't bother me. I had something stronger. Paperwork. Legacy. Truth. That night I was sitting in the kitchen of the real farmhouse, a cup of black coffee cooling in my hand when her name lit up on my phone. I stared at the screen for a moment, watching it buzz on the wooden table. The message preview flashed once. Can we talk? 3 words, Short, almost innocent. But after everything, they felt like a punchline. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to block her. Another part wanted to ignore her into oblivion. But the bigger part, the one that had survived her betrayal, was curious. Not for her sake, but mine. What could she possibly say now? What story would she spin after watching her illusion crack in front of a lawyer and a man she once vowed to love? So I texted back, "Come to the farmhouse, the real one." She replied with a single question mark. I didn't elaborate. Let her figure it out. An hour later, her car pulled up the gravel path. She must have driven fast, too fast, because I could hear the tires skid slightly as she parked. When she stepped out, I saw her hesitate. She looked around, confused. This part of the land had been off limits for years. I kept it that way on purpose. She had no idea what was here. To her, it was just an overgrown patch of trees and brush. She never once asked why I insisted on maintaining it alone. Now she would see. She approached slowly, her heels crunching over the gravel, her coat pulled tight against the night chill. When she finally reached the porch, she looked up at me with wide eyes. This is the farmhouse?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "The real one?" I watched as her eyes moved over the white brick walls, the antique lanterns glowing softly in the dark, the wooden beams hand-carved by my grandfather. Her mouth parted slightly as if words were forming but couldn't quite push through. "You moved it," she said, stepping slowly onto the porch. "You rebuilt it out here." Brick, I answered. While you were spending weekends in Malibu and wellness retreats in the city, I was out here preserving what mattered. She looked stunned, not just because of what she saw, but because of what it meant. That the house she sold, the one she thought was the crown jewel, was nothing more than a prop. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked through the doorway like she was stepping into a church, quiet, hesitant, reverent. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the old armchair, the fireplace, the framed photos still sitting untouched on the mantel. Her fingers grazed the edge of the oak table as she passed, like she was testing if any of it was real. "I thought I knew this land," she said, more to herself than to me. "I thought we were building something here." "No," I said plainly. "You were waiting for it to grow in value so you could cash out." She turned to face me. "That's not fair." "What part isn't?" I asked. "The part where you sold it behind my back? The part where you funded your boyfriend's dream with my legacy? Or the part where you thought you were clever enough to get away with it?" Her face flushed. For a moment I thought she'd fire back with one of her signature comebacks, the kind she used when we argued about furniture or friends or finances. But this wasn't that version of her. This was something else. Something stripped bare. "I didn't plan it like that," she said finally. "It didn't start that way. I didn't even mean to fall for Ray. Just what?" She looked away. "I felt invisible. You were always working, always obsessed with the land, the trust, the crops. Everything had to be done your grandfather's way. You talked more to your irrigation team than you talked to me. Ray, he made me feel seen." I let that hang in the air. I wasn't going to defend myself. I wasn't going to argue that I worked hard so we could live well, that I kept the legacy intact because someone had to. I wasn't even going to remind her that I'd invited her to be a part of it 100 times before she chose distance over participation. She walked toward the mantel and picked up a photo. Me and grandfather, arms around each other, covered in soil from digging the new water line back in 2011. "He left this to you because he knew you'd protect it," she said quietly, and I tried to sell it like it was nothing. "You didn't just try." I said you did. She put the photo back down and took a deep breath. "Ray's gone. He left the same night you triggered the clause. Said he didn't sign up for drama. His app isn't going anywhere. I haven't heard from him since. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She turned to me again. Her voice was softer now. I didn't love him. I thought I did. I think I just loved the idea of escape, of feeling like someone needed me. You were needed, I said, but you wanted worship. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Honest. I've been staying in a motel, she said finally. My accounts are frozen. My lawyer says I should try to negotiate a settlement. There's nothing left to negotiate, I said. You violated the trust. The house you live in, not yours. The car lease through the estate. Even your name is on the list for court restitution. You don't need a lawyer. You need accountability. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't move. I'm sorry, she whispered. I nodded. That's a start. She sat down at the table, her shoulders slumped. The powerful, calculating woman who once stood over me in arguments now looked like someone who had lost her map. I don't want anything from you, she said. I just wanted you to know. I get it now. What this place means. What I ruined. I poured her a glass of water and slid it across the table. It wasn't just a house. It was history. She nodded slowly, gripping the glass like it was the only solid thing left in her life. I should go, she said after a while. I opened the door for her. She paused in the doorway and turned back. Thank you for not humiliating me, she said. I didn't need to, I replied. You did that yourself. She walked out into the night, her silhouette fading into the shadows like a ghost retreating to wherever it came from. I stood there for a while, staring at the spot where she'd sat. The house felt heavier somehow, like it had absorbed everything she said. But it also felt stronger, like the truth had finally settled into the floorboards. I turned off the lights and walked upstairs. She had finally seen the real farmhouse. But more importantly, she had finally seen what she gave up. The next morning was colder than usual. The kind of morning where the frost clings to every surface like a warning. I stood on the back porch of the real farmhouse, a thermos of coffee in one hand and the other tucked in my coat pocket. The field stretched out in every direction, silent and waiting like they were holding their breath. I watched a few birds flutter from one branch to the next in the old oak trees, the only movement in an otherwise still world. It was peaceful, but I knew that peace had a price, and I was about to collect. I had spent the last few days reviewing everything, every account Leah touched, every credit card she used, every subtle withdrawal masked as miscellaneous expenses. She had been draining money behind my back for years, not in dramatic sums, but in quiet, calculated ways. Small transfers to private accounts, new accounts I hadn't even known existed, gifts she bought for friends but never explained, donations to fitness charities with Ray's name listed on the advisory board, even a small wire-labeled business development that had ended up in a shell company. And all of it was mine. My money, my effort, my family's legacy. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was how easy it had been for her to do it, and how easy it had been for me to miss it. I sat at my desk in the study, the windows open just enough to let the chill keep me awake. In front of me was a binder I'd labeled Withdrawals, Unapproved. Each page told a story of betrayal. Some were petty, some were surgical. All of them were dishonest. By the time the sun had fully risen, I knew what I had to do. There was a second clause, a part of the estate trust buried in legal language and overlooked by almost everyone. Everyone except Miles, and now me. It was called the fraud clause. It stated that if a legal spouse committed financial misconduct, defined as theft, unauthorized asset liquidation, or fraudulent transactions, they forfeited all access to jointly owned assets, until a full investigation by the Family Trust Board concluded. But the real blow. The clause also authorized the trust to immediately lock or reassign all estate-related holdings to the original heir. Everything. The house Leah was still technically squatting in, the car registered under her name. Even the passive investments she'd been benefiting from for years, dividends from land leases, profits from the vineyard partnership, trust fund interest accounts. They could all be seized, reassigned, or frozen with a single court submission. In a day, I would pull that lever. I met Miles at his office by 10 a.m. sharp. He was already waiting. Tie loosened slightly. Glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the file I'd sent him the night before. "She skimmed more than I expected," he said, flipping through the binder. "But you documented it well. This is more than enough." "I want to trigger the fraud clause," I said. "All of it." He looked up at me. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He nodded. "Then let's get to work." We spent the next few hours preparing the formal filings, statements, affidavit, transfer requests. I signed where needed. He notarized where required. By noon, it was done. "All we need to do is deliver this packet to the county clerk and the trust board office." He said after that she's locked out, and so by 2 p.m., the trigger was pulled. It didn't take long for the consequences to unfold. At 3:47 p.m., I got a call from the local sheriff's office. They've been dispatched to her address to deliver the notice of eviction and asset freeze. No drama, they said. She answered the door, confused, tried to argue, but when they handed her the envelope, she went silent, signed for it, then stepped back inside and shut the door. At 4:22, she tried to access the joint account. Denied. At 4:29, her card was declined at a boutique she frequented downtown. The owner, who also happened to be the cousin of one of my ranch managers, texted me personally. "Your wife tried to use a frozen card. Looked shaken. Didn't make a scene, though." At 5:02, my phone rang again. It was her. I stared at the screen, let it ring twice, then picked up. "You froze everything," she said, voice sharp and breathless. I triggered the clause. I replied evenly. "You activated it the moment you started taking what wasn't yours." "You can't do this," she hissed. "I have nowhere to go." "You had a house," I said. "You sold it. You had savings. You drained them. You had a marriage. You threw it away." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know it would come to this. You didn't care where it would go as long as it got you what you wanted." She was quiet for a beat. Then, Ray's gone. Everyone's gone. "I'm not surprised," I said. "People like him only stick around when there's something to take." "You're not even angry," she said, almost in disbelief. "You sound like you're reading from a script." "I'm past anger," I replied. "Anger was last week. This is something different. This is clarity." Silence. Then softly, "What happens now?" "Now," I said, leaning back in my chair, "now you live with the choices you made, and I rebuild what you tried to destroy." She hung up. No screaming, no begging. Just the soft, resigned sound of someone who realized the door had finally shut. That night, I went through the house and made notes for restoration. Floors to be polished, paint to be stripped, furniture to be replaced. I called Jacob, the same carpenter who helped me rebuild the replica farmhouse, and asked if he was free next month. He said yes. And when I told him why, he said simply, "About time." I spent the rest of the evening walking the land, breathing the cold air, watching my breath hang in front of me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. There was no parade in my chest, no thrill of revenge, just a steady beat of purpose. She took what she could because she thought I'd never fight back. Because I'd spent so long loving quietly, supporting patiently, listening when no one else would. She mistook my calm for weakness. But calm isn't weakness. It's preparation. It's restraint. And now that the rope had been pulled, the curtain lifted, the game exposed, there was only one thing left to do. Begin again. The next morning, the frost had melted into mist, and the weight of what I had done settled into the walls of the house like silence after a storm. Triggering the fraud clause hadn't been a whim. It was a line in the sand, one that couldn't be crossed again. I knew Isla would try something. She always did. When cornered, she'd squirm, then charm, then throw herself into chaos, hoping someone else would clean it up. But this time, I was done being the cleaner. I had barely finished my coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Miles. "She's already called 3 different attorneys," he said without preamble. 2 declined. 1 agreed until he read the trust documents. I smirked. "They read the clause twice," he said, his tone dry. "The language is clear. The moment you sign that trigger, everything in her name tied to the estate was locked. She's calling it theft." I reminded her it was preservation. "She won't stop," I said. "No," he agreed, "but she'll lose." That afternoon, I visited the Trust Board's regional office, a modest 2-story building tucked between a law firm and a florist. But what went on inside carried the weight of legacy. Generational wealth doesn't rely on passion. It runs on documents, signatures, and unbreakable clauses, something Leah had never understood. I met with Miranda DeWitt, chair of the local estate division, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a voice that didn't need to rise above a whisper to command attention. She greeted me with a firm nod, gesturing to a chair. "We've reviewed the documents. Every transfer, every expense, every login trail. You did your homework." "I had to," I said. "She was siphoning my life while sleeping beside me." "She's not the first," Miranda said, not unkindly. "Entitlement dressed as love rarely ends quietly." She slid a folder across the table. "Here's the formal confirmation. As of 10 a.m., Leah Toiver is locked out of all estate-linked accounts, properties, and legal privileges. She cannot access, contest, or claim anything unless she wishes to fight the trust in court. And even then, the burden of proof falls entirely on her." I nodded. Let her try. "Just be ready," Miranda said, locking eyes with me. "This is the part where they scramble. Desperate people get noisy." Noisy was right. By evening, my inbox was filled with M. "How could you do this to her? She made a mistake. This isn't justice, it's cruelty. You're being cold, vindictive." Cold? No, I had been warm for too long. I had given kindness where I should have given boundaries. And now, when I finally stood up for what was mine, they called it cold. But I didn't respond. Instead, I sat on the front porch that night, watching the stars come out over the land. The house was quiet, steady. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt clarity. Not peace exactly, but direction. And then, as if on cue, I heard tires on gravel. I didn't move. A beat-up black sedan rolled to a stop at the edge of the drive. Leah stepped out, coat wrapped tight around her, eyes searching the dark until they landed on me. She didn't come any closer than the bottom step. "I know I can't win," she said. "They told me that." I said nothing. Let the silence answer her. "I know I hurt you," she continued, "but it wasn't all fake. We had something once, didn't we?" "Once," I said. She looked down at her hands. "I was scared. You were slipping away. The house, the land, your work. You always had somewhere else to be." Rye made me feel like I mattered. "And so you sold my legacy," I replied, calm and sharp. "To feel significant." Tears welled in her eyes. "I made a mistake." "No," I said, "a mistake is spilling coffee. You made a choice over and over again." She took a deep breath. "I have nothing left. Ray's gone. My name is ruined. My friends don't return my calls. My mom's cut me off. I don't even have an apartment now. You had a home. I said you burned it." She stood there a moment longer. Then with trembling fingers, she reached into her coat and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "What's that?" "My confession," she said. "A statement detailing everything. The transfers, the app scam, the forged signature. I wrote it for the trust board for you." I stood slowly, walked down the steps, and took the envelope. "I'll review it," I said. "Will that help? It'll decide how you leave this behind," I said plainly, with a whisper or a lawsuit. She laughed bitterly, wiping at her face. "Even now you're still controlled." "No," I said, turning away. "I'm just no longer yours to manipulate." She got in her car and drove off without another word. Back inside, I opened the letter. It was sloppily written, but it was honest. She admitted to every transaction, every lie, every meeting with Rye. She even included dates, account names, and descriptions of when she started feeling like stealing felt safer than asking. I handed it to Miles the next morning. He read it silently. "We'll keep this. Could save us weeks of litigation." "Use it as leverage," I said. "Not to punish her, just to end this clean." He nodded. By Friday, the trust board sent their final notice in exchange for the signed confession and permanent forfeited of all estate claims that would spare her from court. She would not face criminal prosecution, but she would be legally barred from any future claims, assets, or public statements about the trust, me, or the estate. It was done. The trap had been sprung, not with anger, not with shouting, but with truth. She fell in slowly, and now she couldn't climb back out. I spent that evening back on the land, watching the wind ripple across the wheat like the surface of a lake. I felt lighter, not happy, but lighter, because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like soil settling after the rain. The farmhouse stood tall again. It had taken weeks of planning, hiring, lifting, and rebuilding, but the soul of the estate had started to breathe again. There was something sacred about restoring something that had been damaged. Not just the land, but myself, too. The truth is, when Leah betrayed me, she didn't just sell a property. She tried to erase years of devotion, decades of labor, generations of sacrifice. But the roots of this place ran deeper than her reach. The front porch had been sanded and stained anew. The paint peeled by the sun and years of storms was replaced with a clean coat of whitewash, just like my grandfather had done every spring. The weather vane creaked slightly in the breeze, its rust now scrubbed clean. Inside, I'd removed the last traces of her. Every framed photo that once held our smiles together had been boxed away. The kitchen no longer smelled like citrus cleaner and artificial candles. It smelled like cinnamon, sawdust, and fresh brewed coffee again. But the biggest restoration wasn't the structure. It was the silence. Good silence. The kind that didn't ache, the kind that let you hear your own thoughts without flinching. One by one, I'd called back the people who once made this land thrive. Raoul, the groundskeeper who had left when Leah restructured operations and replaced him with a landscaping app. Ms. Delaney, the seasonal cook who used to prepare fresh pies for tour guests, let go with no warning. Even Carter, the farmhand who used to repair fences and run the harvest trucks. I found him 2 towns over working at a car wash. When I asked him to return, he cried. We rebuilt quietly. No press, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. just people who cared about the land coming back to do what they did best. I doubled their pay, set up housing allowances, reopened the old guest barn, and turned it into a community workspace. If Leia had tried to turn this estate into a cash grab, I would turn it into something better, stronger, not just on paper but in purpose. The crops were next. Most of the fields had been left to rot. Irrigation lines clogged fencing down. The soil compacted and tired, but we worked it back to life. We cleared the overgrowth, tested the nutrients, brought in livestock rotation to aerate the dirt. For weeks I came home with sore legs, blisters, and dirt under my nails. And it felt good because it was mine, earned, preserved. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hill and painted everything in gold, I stood at the edge of the northern field and watched the workers pack up. Raoul gave me a thumbs up from the tractor. Carter shouted something about beer. I waved and promised I'd bring cold ones tomorrow. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Not rushed, careful, hesitant. I turned. It was Sophia. Not a stranger. A neighbor. One of the few who had stayed silent during Leia's downfall. Not out of spite, but caution. Sophia had always been kind to us, even when Leia barely acknowledged her. She had a quiet strength, ran a floral nursery just down the road, and once gave me homemade jam when I'd helped her fix her fence after a storm. She held a small basket in her hands full of biscuits and herbs. "I heard the orchard's back up," she said. "Thought I'd come see for myself." I smiled. It's breathing again. She looked past me to the trees in the distance. It's good seeing this place alive. Felt like a ghost town for a while. It was, I admitted. But ghosts don't get to keep the keys. She chuckled at that and stepped closer and handed me the basket. I don't want to intrude. I just wanted to say I'm glad you stayed. I nodded. I almost didn't. I know, she said. But the land needs people who remember where it came from. I looked at her then, not just as a neighbor, but as someone who understood what legacy meant. And I realized how rare that was. "Thank you," I said, more sincerely than I'd said anything in a long while. She left not long after, but that moment stayed with me because rebuilding wasn't just about structures or soil. It was about people, community, trust, not just in others, but in yourself again. I spent that night in the old reading room, the fire crackling in the hearth. The house creaked in familiar places, not because it was falling apart, but because it was settling, like an old soul stretching its limbs after a long sleep. I pulled out the old ledger my grandfather had used to track crop cycles. Inside were notes from decades ago, pencil-scrolled margins about weather patterns, planting predictions, even reminders to talk to the chickens more. They seemed tense. One entry stood out. "If the land ever falls into the wrong hands, remember this. It doesn't die. It waits for someone worthy, someone patient, someone who listens." I ran my fingers over the ink. It hadn't died, and I had waited, and now I was listening. In the following weeks, the estate began to bloom, not just the trees and crops, but the spirit of the place. People began showing up again. Old friends, former business partners who had once written me off after Isla's betrayal. Some apologized. Most didn't. And that was fine because I wasn't bitter. I was better. Even Leia, for all the destruction she left behind, had given me something. Perspective. She taught me how blind trust can be a trap, how silence isn't always kindness, how love, when left untended, becomes entitlement. But more than anything, she taught me how to start again. By month's end, the estate had a new name, not Toiver Acres anymore. That name was gone with her. I renamed it Red Hill Farm, a nod to the clay-rich soil that stained your boots when the rain came heavy. honest, strong, unmistakable. I had new signage carved from oak installed at the front gate with care. Sophia was the first to see it. She smiled. "Looks good." "It feels right," I said, and it did, because I wasn't restoring what had been lost. I was building something new with the bones of the past. Yes, but for a future no one could steal again. 2 months had passed since I triggered the final clause. 2 months since the silence on my land had changed from suffocating to sacred. Each sunrise felt earned. Each small victory, a patch of revived soil, a restored barn beam. The return of a seasonal worker was no longer a bandage over pain, but a brick laid into something permanent. But there was still one thread left untied. Not legal, not financial. Personal. Yaila's attorney reached out through official channels with a settlement proposal. I'd been expecting it. It was written in that half-apologetic, half-cautious tone that lawyers use when their clients have finally run out of cards to play. The letter admitted that Leah could not challenge the trust. Not legally, not ethically. Her confession had made sure of that. She had no grounds left, no loophole, no defense. What she wanted now, apparently, was dignity. Her lawyer called it a graceful exit. The offer was simple. If I agreed to a formal settlement outside of court, she would sign over all remaining property and assets tied to the trust, issue a public statement acknowledging her misconduct, and never attempt to contact or interfere with the estate again. In return, I would cover her legal fees and not pursue public litigation. It was objectively a good deal, clean, efficient, final. But I wasn't interested in final. I was interested in understanding. So I agreed to the terms, but added one condition of my own. She had to come in person and sign it. No digital signature, no courier, no evasions. Face to face. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in Miles Guerra's office, the same place where she'd once sat beside Ray, smiling, dismissive, confident in her plan. Now she would return to that same table alone. I arrived early. Miles poured coffee and said nothing, though the look in his eyes told me he knew this wasn't about closure on paper. 10 minutes past the hour. She arrived. Different. Not dramatically broken or suddenly humbled, but quieter. She wore a black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. No makeup, no jewelry. She looked smaller, not in stature, in presence, like someone who had been unraveling thread by thread and only just noticed how bare the spool had become. She nodded at Miles, then looked at me. "Hi." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just gestured for her to sit. She slid into the chair across from me and opened the folder on the table. Her hands were steady. She flipped through the pages like someone who already knew what she was giving up. "I read every line," she said twice. "You understand what it means?" Miles asked. "Yes," she said. "It means I walk away with nothing." I looked at her. "It means you walk away with your name. That's more than you gave me." She flinched, just slightly, but enough. "I deserve that," she admitted. "No," I said, "you deserve the consequences. This is just resolution." She nodded again, then reached for the pen. She paused just before signing. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I know I don't deserve that. I just wanted to say I wasn't trying to ruin you. You just didn't care if you did," I said evenly. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I kept thinking I'd fix it later, that somehow if Ray's business took off, I'd pay it all back, make it up to you. But it wasn't about money. I said it was never about the dollars. It was about loyalty, integrity. And you sold those for a fantasy. She signed the papers. Miles gathered them, checking the signatures, then slid the final document into his folder. "It's done," he said. But it wasn't. Not quite. She turned to me, voice soft. I see everything now. The real house, the real land, the real you. I didn't see any of it before. I just saw what I thought was holding me back. I didn't respond. Let her speak. I thought power meant control, she continued. But I see now that real power is restraint. You could have destroyed me, publicly, legally. But you didn't. No, I said. I let the truth do it. She stood slowly, gathering her coat. Thank you for not dragging my name through the mud. You did that yourself? I replied. Not cruelly, just honestly. She lingered at the door for a moment. If you ever need help on the farm, volunteer work, I'd show up just to give something back. I shook my head. There's no debt left to pay here, but there's a life out there you still have to live. Go build something real this time. And with that, she left. The silence that followed her exit was different than the one before it. Not tense, not bitter, just complete. A chapter finally closed. That evening, I returned to the farmhouse. The porch lights were warm, the house buzzing with the quiet rhythm of a life no longer interrupted by betrayal. I poured a glass of bourbon, stepped outside, and sat in my grandfather's old rocking chair. For years, I thought justice was something loud. Courtrooms, accusations, revenge. But I was wrong. Justice, real justice, is quiet. It's choosing not to swing when you're holding the sword. It's letting someone destroy themselves by their own choices. It's knowing you could humiliate them and deciding not to. The next day I received a delivery, a single envelope. Inside was a check modest in amount with a note to cover my last month in the lake house. I know it doesn't matter, but I wanted to leave one door closed properly. Signed, Leia. I didn't cash it. I didn't even deposit it. I tucked it in the back of the ledger behind the entries my grandfather once wrote under the note about talking to the chickens. Because not every gesture needs a transaction. Some are just a period at the end of a long, broken sentence. The morning light spilled through the windows of the real farmhouse like honey, soft and golden, stretching across the wooden floors and warming the air with that familiar glow I hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of light that made you stop mid-step just to breathe it in. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching as the mist rolled off the fields. The land looked alive again, not just green and blooming, but proud, like it knew it had been defended. A year had passed since the call that shattered everything, and I was still here, still standing. But I wasn't the same man who had answered the phone that day at the airport terminal, briefcase in hand, passport tucked in my coat pocket, eyes fixed on a life built around certainty. That man was gone, and in his place stood someone quieter, stronger, and more deliberate. I had learned a lot since then, that love without respect is just dependency dressed up in vows. That silence is not always peace. It's sometimes a warning, and that sometimes the only way to reclaim what's yours is not to fight louder, but to stand still and let the storm run out of breath. After signing the final documents and watching Isla walk away for the last time, the months that followed weren't about revenge or celebration. They were about building, rebuilding the farm, rebuilding the team, rebuilding myself. I returned to the land like a soldier returns home after battle, changed, cautious, but determined. Each morning began with a walk along the east field. The path had become a ritual. I'd check the rows of young crops, feel the soil between my fingers, make notes in the old leather-bound notebook my grandfather had left me. The simple act of observing growth, patient, steady, quiet, taught me more about healing than any therapist could. The workers had settled into a rhythm again. Raoul ran the greenhouse like a general, Carter took pride in the new irrigation lines. Miss Delaney had returned to the kitchen and was once again feeding anyone who walked through her door. Farmhands, visitors, even the occasional traveler who found our little slice of land by accident. And Sophia, well, Sophia had become something steady, too. It started with biscuits and conversation, then shared walks through the orchard. She never pressed, never asked questions about Leia or the past. She simply listened, laughed, and showed up. Sometimes that's all it takes. One afternoon, we sat beneath the willow tree by the creek, watching the water slip by like it didn't have a care in the world. "You ever think," she said, "that maybe the land kept you so rooted, so you wouldn't blow away when the storm came?" I looked at her and smiled. Every day the truth was, legacy isn't just something we inherit. It's something we preserve through choices, through quiet decisions made when no one's watching, through the people we let into our lives and the ones we let go of. Lilo is gone now. No calls, no emails, just silence. The clean kind. Word around town was she'd moved 3 states away, started working at a small nonprofit, and hadn't tried to use the Toiver name again. That name didn't mean anything anymore. Not since I renamed the estate. Red Hill Farm had become more than a fresh start. It became a symbol of what survives, of what matters. Every Sunday morning I'd sit on the porch and sip coffee as the sun came up. And every Sunday, without fail, Sophia would walk up the path from her nursery, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with nothing but a smile. We didn't need labels. Not yet. Maybe not ever. We were just 2 people who understood that healing didn't always need a destination. One particular morning, as the wind picked up and the wheat danced in the field like waves, I found myself reading the last letter my grandfather ever wrote me. I'd kept it tucked inside the back of the ledger behind Wyla's uncashed check and a sprig of lavender Sophia had once handed me without explanation. If the day ever comes when the world tries to take this from you, remember you're not just defending land. You're defending history. The kind that can't be measured in acres or dollars. The kind that lives in your bones. He was right. This place was never about ownership. It was about stewardship, about keeping something alive that others would have let die. That night, I hosted a small gathering on the porch. Just the core crew, Raoul, Miss Delaney, Carter, and Sophia. No speeches, no toasts, just laughter, warm food, and stories under the she laughed. I see a man who let go of what broke him without breaking anyone else. That's rare. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled and took another sip of bourbon. When the night ended and everyone went home, I stayed out on the porch a little longer. The air was cool and the stars were endless. And in that stillness, I let out a long, deep breath. Not out of relief, but because I finally could. Because the farmhouse she tried to sell was never really mine to lose. Because I had never been broken, just buried. And now, I was growing again. Rooted in truth, watered by patience, and surrounded by people who saw the man beneath the wreckage. Not a victim, not a fool, but a keeper of something sacred, something that would never be sold.